All right, in this video, we're going to write the backend code and our store code for dealing with logging in and logging out and how we're going to deal with authentication. The first thing I'm going to do, however, is I'm going to fix a tiny little typo I had in my components users SCSS. You guys probably caught that, but that's not how you spell overflow. So make sure you do that, otherwise you won't get your scroll bars. Anyway, let's go ahead and start off with our users module and talk about how we're going to deal with authentication. So inside of our server, in our modules, in users, what I want to do is I want to make it so that we can log in and log out from our users module. And what that's going to do is not only is it going to add the user to the list, by the way, we can remove this code that's automatically adding users to the list. We don't need that anymore. But it's going to add the users to the list. And it's also going to set a special property on our client so that it can notify other modules that that user is authenticated. And we're going to implement that with symbols. So to start off, let's go ahead and scroll up to the top, and I'm going to create a symbol. It's going to be const auth context equals symbol auth context. And so we're using this, and we're not exporting it because the only module I want to know about this symbol is the users module. So to see how we're going to use the auth context, what I'm going to do is underneath our get color for username, I'm going to say get user for client, and he's simply going to say const auth equals client at auth context. If not auth, return null, otherwise return auth. So with that out of the way, well, we can probably fix that up. If not auth, auth null. Whoops, other way around. Return auth, auth null. Just making sure that we coalesce anything from undefined or whatever and coalesce that into a null, because I like nulls more than undefines when returning something from a public API. A null is an absence of a value, and undefined is a programming error, usually. Anyway, so get user for client, that's how we're going to attach the attach auth information to the client and how we're going to retrieve it. But how do we add it in? Well, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to create a login client method. But what's interesting about this is I also need to talk a little bit about how we're going to validate things. Now, we're in a very interesting situation here where both the server and the client are both running in JavaScript, meaning there's no reason why we can't share validation logic between the server and the client. And in fact, we have an awesome little folder right here that we could put just generic validation so we don't have to repeat it twice. And I think that is a great idea. So let's go ahead and do that. What I'm going to do is in shared, I'm going to create a new class called validator, validator.js. And validator is basically going to be nothing more than a class that's responsible for containing error information. So first of all, I'm going to say import import observable from RxJS. And I'm going to say export class validator. And he's going to have a getIsValid method, which will return this error's or not this error's length. He's going to have a get errors, which will return this errors. And then he's also going to have a get message, which is going to return the errors formatted into a single string, which we're going to implement very simply as errors join on a comma. Next up, for his constructor, not surprisingly, we're going to initialize our errors array to an empty array. And then I'm also going to have an error method called message, which simply says this errors push message. I'm also going to have a toObject method, which says if this is valid, return empty object. Otherwise return errors is this errors and message is this message. Finally, I'll have a throw money method, which will return observable.throw. And the observable.throw will have the message in it. So it'll have message is this message. So that'll allow us to easily integrate this into a RxJS pipeline. So now with that out of the way, let's go ahead and create the validation rules for our user. So I'm also going to do that in shared, but I'm going to do that in a new folder. I'm going to create a new folder called validation, not surprising. And I'm going to create a new file in it called users, also not surprising. And this will contain all of the general validation rules for a user. Now, it's important to understand that this validation runs both on the server and the client. Certain things cannot be done in both contexts. For example, on the client, we can't validate if the user is already logged in. Well, we could, but that wouldn't be very secure. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm only going to validate properties based upon themselves. Things that I don't care if someone spoofs this validation and gets past it, because the server is then going to have the final say in if the operation is indeed valid. So we're going to say import validator from validator. And I'm going to say export let username regex equals, and I'm going to write a quick regex. So start string, word character, in brackets, word character, digit character, underscore and dash, end bracket, one to many, and then end string. So this regex will only allow word character and digit characters as well as underscores and dashes. And I'll have an export function validate login with the username. And I'll say const validator equals new validator. I'll say if username.length is greater or equal to 20, we'll say validator error username must be fewer than 20 characters. And then I'll say if not username regex test username validator error username can only contain numbers, digits, underscores, and dashes. And then we'll return validator. So that is how we're going to validate the login on both the client and the server. So let's move back into our server modules users and finish and write our login method. So I'm going to write a method called login client money that takes in a client and a username. Now, I'm doing login client money because these sort of operations will generally hit a database or the file system or something, some sort of asynchronous operation, maybe an API request. So I'm preemptively, even though this will be a synchronous method, I am preemptively making it so that we can very easily add a asynchronous pipeline in it in the future. First of all, I'm going to say username equals username.trim. Then I'm going to say const validator equals, and I'm going to import the validate login function from our shared code. So to do that, we're going to jump up to the top. I'm going to say import validate login from shared validation users. And now I can scroll down to the bottom again, so make sure you import that. Now I can scroll to the bottom again and say validate login username. And I can say if not validator is valid, then I can return a failure. Now, this actually gets a little interesting with the way that I can do this. Because we are running in a asynchronous, or rather a synchronous method, but we are still returning an observable. What we would have to do here is say return observable dot throw, and then pass in a client message is validator dot message, right? Instead, at this point, we can say validator dot throw, return validator dot throw money, and I did make a mistake with that. I'm sorry, guys. The validator should be not message, but client message. Remember, client message is the special property that our infrastructure will pick up on and send that data back to the user, as opposed to anything else which will not be sent back to the user. So make sure you make that quick change. So we can say return validator throw, and that'll work. And the next step I want to take is if the username is already taken. So to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to fix my constructor up a little bit. I know I'm jumping around a little bit, but we had some code up there that we don't need anymore. And scroll up, and you'll see up here, our user list equals this garbage array. Well, let's just make user list equals normal array, and then also make a users hash, a users object. We're going to use this users object to keep track of who's logged in and who isn't based off of username. So now I'm going to scroll back down. Now I can say if not or rather, if this user's has own property username, then somebody else already has that name. However, here's an issue. I want to return observable.throw client message, blah, blah, blah. But I don't want to type this out all the time, every time I do a failure. I don't want to have to type in client message all the time. It's error prone. As you saw already, I already messed it up once. I want to abstract this whole thing into a function. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up my observable socket. And I'm going to scroll up to the top, and I'm going to make two helper methods. The first helper method will be export function fail message, which is very similar to the client message error that we can throw, but we're not throwing exceptions here. This isn't exception worthy, so I'm not bothering with the client message. But the fail will simply return observable.throw, passing in client message is message. I'm also going to do a success observable, and the success observable will simply be an empty observable. So what I'm going to do, instead of calling observable.empty all the time, I'm going to create a success observable and cache it and say observable.empty. And then I'm going to say export function success and say return success observable. Save on memory a little bit. All right, so those are our fail and success methods. Now we can use them by first scrolling up to the top and importing those methods. So I can import fail from shared observable socket. And now I can scroll down, and instead of this nonsense, I can replace it with return fail, and then simply pass in my message. Someone, or username, I should probably put this in a template string. Username is already taken. The final check I want to do is to say is to do this. Const auth equals client auth context, or client auth context equals empty object. If auth.isLoggedIn, then return fail, you are already logged in. All right, so what is auth context? Auth context is just an object that contains our authentication data, such as our username or our color, or if we're logged in. And what I'm doing here is I'm saying, okay, try to get the auth context from the client, and if he already has one, return it. Otherwise, make a new one and return that, and then set it to that client's auth context. And now what I can do is say auth.name equals username, auth.color equals this get color for username. Auth.isLoggedIn is true, then I can say this user's username equals client, this user's user list push, and we're going to push the auth in this case, and then I can say this IO emit users added auth, and I can say console log username logged in, and then I simply return observable of auth. So I'm going to return back all the information about the user after they logged in. A very common thing to do in these sort of APIs, where you might not have some information about your user account, such as your color, for example, since we generate that dynamically. Of course, I do need to import observable, so we can do that all the way here at the top. We can say, I'll do that after Lodash. I'll say import observable from RxJS. And then scroll down, and we now have our login client. So let's go ahead and hook this up to where we can hit it from our application. And that's pretty easy. Come down here to register client, auth login. I'll update this to take in an object that has a name property, and I'll simply return users.login client money name. Or, sorry, client :name. And it's not users, it's this. And that's our auth login. We're simply hooking that directly up into that method. But, you know, it doesn't matter that we're doing that, because By separating this out into its own method, it gives us the flexibility of invoking that server side if we ever need to. If we ever need to directly invoke that from server code. And so I wouldn't put an immense amount of logic in any of these handlers. They should really defer to something else. That's a significantly more clean way of doing this. But let me scroll up one more time to our login client. And down again to our auth login. Let's go ahead and test this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up our client application. And I'm simply going to delete this. We don't need that anymore. I'm going to say services.userStore. We do need, on our user store, we do need to implement a login method on it. I kind of forgot about that. So let's go ahead and do that. In stores users, I'm going to scroll up to the top and include my validation. So I'm going to import, what am I going to import? Validate login from shared validation users. And then on my user store, after my constructor, I'm going to write a login money name, login money method that is going to say const validator equals validate login name, and if validator has errors, then return observable throw message is validator message. Otherwise, what we want to do is we simply want to return this server emit action money auth login with name. So now services user store, I can now say login, and I can pass in a name of whoa, and I can say dot subscribe, and I can say user, and I can say console log user. And let's see if this works. So coming back over here, let's go ahead and refresh our client. There's a lot changed. User whoa was logged in. Let's duplicate this and see what happens. This guy should get an error. And he does. Client message, username whoa is already taken. So we get that error because we have the error being printed out in the in our infrastructure, our observable socket. So, and you see one user whoa right there. Same with this guy. Now, of course, we don't have any way to actually log in with a specific name, but we're going to do that when we build up our chat component. In the next video, we're going to take a look at how to log out, because right now, if I were to close this out, notice whoa is still there, and that's problematic. So we'll see you guys in the next video.